There are a number of different ways to make adjustments to color or color ranges in Photoshop. We're going to take the next few minutes in order to explore the Vibrance, Hue and Saturation, and Color Balance adjustment layers. The bottom of the Layers panel, I'll use the Adjustment Layer icon and choose Vibrance. In the Properties panel, we can see that there's actually two sliders. There's the Vibrance slider and the Saturation slider. These two sliders are both relative, and the Vibrance slider isn't going to change the yellows and oranges as much as the Saturation slider, so it's really good for popping color in an image, in this case like the blues, but not going overboard in the yellows, which in an environmental portrait means that you could get nice blue skies, but not give the people a sunburn. All right, let me set that back to 0. And let's take a look at when I move the saturation over. Now we can see that the saturation is saturating not only the blues, but all the colors equally throughout the image, although it is still relative. So by that, I mean it's trying to keep a relative difference between the colors so they don't all end up at the exact same 100% saturation. And that's going to help to prevent losing any detail. Now, if we go the other way with saturation, I am going to lose all of the saturation or the color in the image, but there are really better ways to convert your images to black and white. For example, you can use the black and white adjustment layer. So let's go ahead and change that back to 0. And I just want to show you with Vibrance, change to -100, you still actually see a little bit of color in your image. And of course, you can use these two sliders together. So I could use the Vibrance, for example, to increase the blues without making much of an adjustment to the yellows, and then use the saturation in order to decrease the overall saturation of the entire image. All right, let's hide that layer on the Layers panel. Another way to make both global changes as well as selective changes to specific color ranges is by adding the Hue and Saturation adjustment layer. I can make global changes by just moving the Hue slider here when it's set to Master. I'll go ahead and undo that using Command Z. Or we can go in and we can select a specific color range. So I could choose the cyans, for example, and then just change the hues in the cyan areas. All right, again, I'll use Command Z to undo that. All right, let's return to the master here to change all of the colors. Just want to point out when I move saturation over to the right, it is not a relative slider, and you can see it really goes quite crazy, making everything fully saturated. So let's undo that using Command Z. Now there's also an on-screen adjustment tool for the hue and saturation. When I pick that up and then click, say, in the wall area and drag left or right, by default, it's going to be changing the saturation. But if you hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows, it will change the hue instead of the saturation. Again, I'll undo that using Command Z. Now let's talk a little bit more about selecting and changing specific color ranges. So you'll notice that when I had the on-screen adjustment, it automatically selected the yellows. And if I desaturate this, we can see using the two rainbows below a preview of what the yellows look like and below what they look like after they've been desaturated. If we change the hue, it would show us the hue instead in the bottom rainbow. So the area between these two white bars, that area is going to be fully adjusted, or you will see 100% of the adjustment that you make above. The areas to the left and to the right, in between the white bars and these triangles, that's the fade range. And you can adjust this and make them closer together or further apart. And you'll notice when I do that, when I move them closer together, that fade range can be problematic because if you don't have enough values there, you're definitely going to see what's adjusted and what's not. So be a little careful as you move those. You'll want to keep a good amount of space there. We can also shift the colors that are being affected by just clicking and dragging in between those two white bars. And we can increase the number of colors that they affect by clicking on the bar itself and then scooting out the fade range. All right, let's click on the reset icon here. And all I want to do is just change the hue of the yellows. So I'll click with my on-screen adjustment and drag them down to make them desaturated, and then hold down the Command key or the Control key and just move them a little bit more towards orange. All right, let's toggle off the visibility of hue saturation. And the last adjustment that we're going to make is color balance. And the benefit to color balance is that I can change the shadows, midtones, and highlights independently of one another. So I'll choose shadows and enable the preserve luminosity. And if I want to cool down the shadows, I could just move the yellow-blue slider towards blue. Or if I wanted to warm them up, I could move them more towards yellow. I might also move the cyan red slider more towards red. We could go into the midtones, and if I wanted to actually take out some of the yellows, then I could move it towards blue, kind of neutralizing all of these tiles. And of course, I don't have to use these to make corrections to my image. I can do creative things. So for example, if I move this more towards green in the highlights and maybe more towards cyan, well, then I get kind of this eerie, maybe futuristic, bleak effect. So there you have it, 3 easy ways to make adjustments to color using the Vibrance, the Hue and Saturation, or the Color Balance adjustment layers in Photoshop.